Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth week of our class. So, you've got a short reading for this week, but it is incredibly dense, and I hope this first slide helps to get you thinking about it a little bit. We've discussed a lot of revolutions so far in this class, and one thing that I would say is pretty constant in history is that whenever things change, there are people who wish they hadn't. Those people who embrace the ideas of classical liberalism and revolutions were ultimately opposed by people who wished to conserve previous social, political, and economic orders, hence the name conservative. I want to illustrate a few examples of how conservatism in the 19th century differed from conservatism today, as well as look at the term liberalism. So, one big difference is that many of today's conservatives want to preserve the classically liberal policies of 250 years ago, while opposing more modern economic and socially liberal policies. I've hinted at this in past weeks that the way we use the terms today is essentially the opposite of how the terms were used 200 years ago, conservative and liberal. But I want to give some very specific examples in today's class too, and I hope this slide helps. The late Rush Limbaugh, I may have been more critical of him had were it not for the fact that he just died this week. I put these slides together a while ago, but of course it's appropriate to extend condolences to his family and those who loved him. Uh, but Rush Limbaugh, didn't have much in common with the conservatives of another era. For instance, those fictionally depicted in the PBS series Downton Abbey, which is set around World War One, and thereafter I haven't watched it. I watched the first couple. But anyways, so for last week's discussion board, I asked you to decide whether you thought ideas or technologies were more important to the creation of the modern world. Sorry, not last week, but 2 weeks ago. And for me, technological innovation is just the icing on the cake of the amazing, enlightened, and liberal ideologies of the era. They would not have been possible without the ideologies that allowed people the freedom of thought, the freedom of action to come up with the amazing inventions of the 19th century. And yet, they were some pretty cool technologies. I just have a menagerie of them here. And, I want to shift gears now and tell a story before we get into more specifics of conservatism and liberalism. So this story is the story of Faust, as rewritten by Johann Wolfgang Goethe in play form in the year 1808, at a time when his native Prussia was part of the Napoleonic Empire. Faust had been a traditional Christian morality play about a guy named Faust who got a girl named Gretchen pregnant, and it was out of wedlock and therefore quite problematic. Gretchen died as a consequence of her childbirth, and which was not at all uncommon in the early 19th century, or in the medieval period when it set, and Faust felt horribly guilty for what he had done. So rather than recognize his actions as a sin and turn to Christ for redemption, as you would have done in a traditional Christian morality play, he turned to the devil, as personified by the character Mephistopheles. So Mephistopheles later helps Faust to take his mind off his guilt as Faust becomes a powerful man who works for the king to reclaim land from the sea. Faust builds a castle and helps to create a well-ordered, modern, and clean society. And as he gazes over his realm at one point, he notices that there's an elderly couple who have a cottage blocking his view. He talks with Mephistopheles and asks him to do something about them. Mephistopheles, he's the devil, kills them. So finds out. Faust finds out. That's a little hard to say. Faust finds out and is devastated and unable to enjoy the perfect society that he's created. So then Gretchen appears as an angel with three other women from the Bible, portraying what Faust calls the eternal feminine, in opposition to what he frames as the masculinity of this brave new somewhat horrifying world. So they intercede on behalf of his soul and claim it away from Mephistopheles. So you still have redemption. But anyway, so in the 1980s, Marshall Berman reinterpreted this story of Faust not as a Christian, as written by Goethe, not as a Christian morality play where ultimately grace and forgiveness win out, though he didn't discount that, but as a profound critique of the modern world. For Faust, Christ and pristine powers like that of the eternal feminine were far more powerful than the hope of vain ambition exemplified by modern things. Faust was enormously popular in a period when Napoleon promised to remake the world in an avowedly secular sense. From Faust, then, the term Faustian bargain, another way to say deal with the devil, entered into mainstream usage. And we still use the term today. You may have heard it before, you may be familiar with it. But a Faustian bargain is something done for the greater good, like killing the elderly couple, something negative that's supposed to be for the greater good. Uh, so, the elderly couple whose cottage prevented the existence of his perfect society supposedly needed to go. So I've asked you on the discussion board for this week to think of other Faustian bargains you know of from your own experiences. One example I can give is Route 17, the interstate that cuts through Binghamton. It was built in the 1950s in a way that cut communities right in half, destroying dozens of homes in the process. So it made transportation in the southern tier of New York a lot more efficient, but was it worth the suffering it inflicted on communities? Was it worth that Faustian bargain? So we will deal with many such bargains over the course of this semester. People who suffered for the greater good, who also didn't have a choice in their victimization on behalf of what was supposedly the greater good. So here we are. When we use the word liberal today in our country, we are typically referring to the policies of the Democratic Party or parties that advocate similar, perhaps more extreme policies than Democrats. So conservative then is typically something we construct to be the opposite of liberal. So over 250 years of American and world history, conservative and liberal have meant very different things. So today, we often think of conservatives as referring to those who are pro-business and want minimal government regulations over business. Conservatives are those who believe markets are better solutions to our problems than government, and typically they oppose what they refer to as entitlement programs like public assistance. So in the early 19th century, though, it was liberals who were far more pro-business, and liberals were the ones who wanted minimal government interference in our lives. Conservatives in places like England in particular were the ones who were in favor of poor relief money, in part because they hoped such relief would prop up their aristocratic feudal systems and fend off revolution, especially after the French Revolution. So liberals believed freedom of contract and labor were solutions to poverty, not charity. So a key classically liberal thinker who's still controversial today was Adam Smith. Today, we remember Adam Smith as an economist, the father of capitalism, which means that, if you worry about capitalism's excesses, he might not be seen in the most favorable light. But Smith himself, he never used the term economist. It wasn't around yet. He instead called himself a moral philosopher. Adam Smith believed that if people could be in charge of their own affairs, that they would make decisions that would ultimately benefit society as a whole. So as a classical liberal, he felt that government needed to allow for total freedom, for an invisible hand then to regulate economies. Then if people worked according to their own interests, forces like competition would encourage people to provide the best products at the lowest prices. So in this equation, there was no room for monopolies like the big mercantilist companies of his day, and no room either for slavery. Slavery wasn't just bad for slaves, it was bad for everyone because it caused unfair competition with free laborers, took consumers out of the economy, and most importantly, took intelligent people out of society with all of their potential innovations that would benefit everyone. So, capital and trade, per Smith, should be free, governed by an invisible hand, and by default, this implies people should also have rights to freely move for labor. National borders, for example, only hamper the ultimate growth of prosperity. So that's the core of liberalism. When people have personal liberties, it's better not just for the individual, but for society as a whole. So that's why he called himself a moral philosopher. His most prominent work, The Wealth of Nations, came out in 1776. He was also a supporter of the Americans' desire for representation in Parliament. So conservatives then emerged in opposition to liberalism. They worried that societies like industrializing England were undermining noble privilege and the proper order of society. They often look back fondly on feudal era Europe as a time when things were ordered, people knew their places, and the only people to engage in enterprise were those with permission of the ruler, so typically people with noble blood. So Adam Smith argued that it was ability, not nobility, that mattered. So the epitome of uh, anti free trade for Smith was the giant East India Company. It had a monopoly on the tea trade and was almost single handedly responsible for the destruction of India, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, as well as the destruction of China, as you'll read about this week. So the 19th century was an all around terrible century for so many Chinese people. In the 1830s, the Qing dynasty went to war with the East India Company and by default Great Britain in what was called the Opium War. This was basically a fight against British drug dealers who wanted to dump opium grown in India onto the Chinese to be able to have excess funds to use for tea, for which there was an exploding market in other parts of the British Empire. Rather than address the evil of trying to go to war to force drugs on people who didn't want them, the British government opted to free the trade in opium to China, thereby giving free licenses of dozens of other English merchants to smuggle their illicit drug into Chinese ports. The Chinese lost the Opium War. Within a decade, this weak, delegitimized, we lost both opium wars. This weak, delegitimized government imploded on itself as many rural people rose up against what they felt to be a corrupt and Western tainted government. This horrifying conflict was called the Taiping Rebellion, and in the disease, starvation, and murderous campaigns it entailed, somewhere between 20 and 50 million Chinese people perished. Many British, French, and even American troops fought with the Qing dynasty to put down this rebellion, and it is by far the bloodiest conflict of the 19th century, and on par with the world wars of the next century in its horrific death toll. So, as England began to industrialize, those factory owners at the forefront of progress began to, I can put my face in there, began to embrace Adam Smith's idea that an economy would be best governed by allowing for free trade. Everyone would prosper, they reasoned, if they were uninhibited in their own prosperity. This idea of unregulated capitalism became quite popular again in the 19. I mean, the idea has never gone away, but in the 1980s and has in the United States and has been under serious fire since the 2008 financial meltdown. But under feudalism, which predated capitalism, those with noble privilege were in charge. Under capitalism, those with money or capital were in charge. And in a fair system, the theory was that the smartest, brightest people would have the most money and theoretically lift everyone else up as well. So, as liberalism developed, especially in England and the United States, liberals, like members of the English Whig Party, advocated pro business policies and government investment in infrastructure. The same was happening in the United States. They were against public welfare as something which made the economy inefficient. Conservatives believed in welfare assistance largely to preserve the social order, and conservatives also often opposed pro business policies. So, English conservatives also favored things, oh, where are we? Like the Corn Laws, which put subsidies on domestically produced grain, the source of their wealth, and discouraged workers from moving to cities for factory jobs. So corn was, an early modern English way just to say all types of grain. It was eventually the Irish potato famine that convinced Parliament to repeal the Corn Laws and allow in shipments of cheap American grain and push English people to focus on their marginal advantages in manufacturing over agriculture. But for much of the 19th century, liberals and conservatives believed things that, again, are almost the opposite of liberals and conservatives in much of global politics, especially American politics today. So the consistency lies in conservatives being opposed to changes in social and economic orders, and liberals wanting to broaden access to rights. Conservatives in the US today still sometimes call themselves neoliberals, meaning they want to preserve the small government, anti welfare focus of original liberals. That's why liberal is a root word of today's libertarian movement as well. So your Gonic reading has a nice discussion of English reform movements in the early 19th century, too. So, efforts like ending slavery, protecting child laborers, helping the poor and indigent all received public support. One thing that didn't right away, at least, was expanding suffrage, a key liberal demand. People should have the right to vote. Taking care of people was okay for conservatives, empowering them to take care of themselves, not so much. So the franchise very gradually expanded in England, first to include those who had money rather than just those who had land. This would appeal to factory owners. And then there was the Chartist movement, which wanted all men to have the right to vote. They forgot about women, whose transatlantic suffragist movement would finally be successful in 1920 in the US and 1918 in England. So I really enjoy that Gonick ties in American politics as well to his global discussion of early industrialization and its discontents. For starters, American cotton was critical to industrialization. It was exported to all the industrializing areas of Europe and spearheaded the first attempts at the imperialism of the 19th century in Algeria, Egypt, and India, all for the sake of finding more suitable areas to grow cotton to be able to compete with the American production. One of the ironies of cotton is that it fueled industrialization, which led to newer forms of labor organization, but was primarily produced through the ancient system of slavery. Slavery, under the demands of global capitalism, led to the worst kind of exploitation the world would see until perhaps the labor camps of Nazi Germany. In both cases, human beings were exclusively valued for their productive value, and things like personal autonomy or even family relations received little consideration by masters. So, the very global nature of cotton meant that those resisting exploitation turned to the example of of the British Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which was an amazing anti-slavery movement born out of resistance to another commodity produced by slaves, sugar. So in 1833, people like Frederick Douglass, a former slave, an eloquent speaker, and a committed activist, Charles Finney, a preacher who advocated equality of race and sex, William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist whose newspaper, The Liberator, founded in 1830, was a radical source for lambasting any notion of compromise with slavery, Angela and Sarah Grimke, former slave owners who rejected the privileges of their lives to fight for moral truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an abolitionist and later women's rights leader, and Sojourner Truth. I'm just listing a bunch of people. A former slave and preacher came together to form an organization that would furiously lobby in the United States for the end of slavery. They held meetings, produced media, and lobbied for legislation to restrict the expansion of slavery. They were so feared by Southern politicians that mail in the South became censored, and their newspapers and materials were forbidden. It was a crime for Southerners to have abolitionist literature in many states, which made it easy to make abolitionists out to be these scary people who needed to be fought against at all costs. So, this censorship of free speech in the South really is one of the turning points that led to the Civil War in the United States. Um, but as Americans catapulted towards war, those who wanted to keep the pro-business, pro-capitalist policies of the previous Whig Party, while remaining explicitly anti-slavery, formed the Republican Party in 1854. It's the same one that's still around today. And just like the Democratic Party, which at the time adopted an almost uniform pro-slavery platform, is also the same Democratic Party around today, though obviously not in favor of slavery anymore and very different in its approaches to governance. So as the 1850s progressed in the United States, acts like the Fugitive Slave Law forbidding assistance to runaway slaves, the Dred Scott Supreme Court case, you probably remember this all from American history, um, which ruled that the Constitution didn't apply to black people, radicalized people opposing slavery in the North. Many were eventually willing to fight a war for states' rights, not as the Southern memory of the war used it meaninglessly, but to defend Northern states' rights to be opposed to slavery against the tyranny of Southern slaveholders who had disproportionately strong power in government. So one irony in this period that Gonick shows is that while the United States were consumed in their fight with each other, policies towards native peoples in the West hardened, and the ferocious, sometimes genocidal Indian wars of the second half of the 19th century started almost under the radar while the country was focused on the battlefields of the East. The end result seems that American imperialism would set a standard that other would-be imperialist powers would follow as they carved up Africa and Asia for their own empires. Then again, with the Second World War, as Japan and Germany sought what they felt were their own rightful empires. Okay, so there's a lot in your discussion for this week. I've tried to tie together resistance to early liberalism with early 19th century imperialism. And what we'll see next week and the week thereafter is that in the volatile political climates of 19th century Europe and the United States, one thing for which there was often broad public consensus was that conquering places and imposing imperialism for supposedly enlightened reasons was a good thing. The US was no less imperialistic than European powers, but in my assessment, there was far more opposition to imperialism in the US, at least early on, until the power of socialists grew in Europe. They would become very anti-imperialist as well. So, okay, this was a broad-ranging, wide discussion, much like your broad-ranging, wide discussion in Gonick in only a few pages. But I hope this gives you a bit of grounding so you can make sense of your readings for this week. And as always, have fun with these bonus questions here. Hopefully you have context to make sense of your focus questions, and please reach out to me if you have any questions about anything. I'm always available from 9 to 10 a.m. Monday through Friday at the link listed at the top of the Vanco Hall page. All right, thank you, everyone.